Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Daf Yomi. We're here with our live virtual studio audience, who is as stunning as always, and we have to thousands as well watching on YouTube. We welcome you back to our Daf Yomi shir. We seem to have miraculously bypassed the whole of Masechet Shekalim. It was only a short one, and it kind of encompassed the Sundays during Pesach, so we weren't able to have a shir here on Zoom. And Yoma officially starts in a couple of days' time, so it made sense to go to Maseches Yoma today. So we are going to be doing the first daf of Maseches Yoma. Good morning, Stephen. Lovely to see you on board as well. So that's where we're going to be starting today, ladies and gents. And I'm just going to get... where's everything? We're just going to get it all up on the screen for us over here. Here we go. Okay, so Maseches Yoma it's longer than Maseches Shekalim, right? So we're going to be on this one for the next 87 days. And primarily it's dealing with the halachus of Yom Kippur. The first 7 chapters are going to deal with the specifics of the service in the Beis HaMikdash. And it's fascinating, really, because as you go through it, you will all of a sudden notice that the material that we go through, certainly with the Mishnayot, of the Avodah, everything that took place in the Beis HaMikdash on the day of Yom Kippur, is mirrored and paralleled with the part of the Musaf service in which we go through the Avodah. So now when we get to Musaf on Yom Kippur, and we get to that lengthy bit that a lot of people kind of drift out and drift off for, you will notice that it is exactly what we are dealing with in the Mishnayot of this Masechta. Then the final chapter, once we get to it, is going to actually be about how we recognize Yom Kippur and the 5 forbidden afflictions, as well as the mitzvah of Teshuvah. That's all going to be coming up next 87 days. By the way, Yoma, or Yoma, seems to be a bit of an odd name for a tractate, for a Masechta. When we translate it into Aramaic, a Yom is a Yoma. So what Yom is it? It's Hahu Yoma. It's that day, the day of Yom Kippur. And we're actually starting Masechet Yoma, the day of Yom Kippur, 7 days before Yom Kippur. How typically Jewish. We don't start on the day. We start with the 7 days of preparation that led up to the actual Yom Kippur day. So we're going to be seeing the why the Kohen Gadol has to separate 7 days before Yom Kippur, and we're going to see how that connects to the 7-day preparation process for the burning of the Para Aduma, of the red heifer. And we're going to talk about why he doesn't have to separate before doing other sacrifices. Then we're also going to bring in a bit of Shmini Atzeres and the rest of Sukkot. So it's a juicy daf today, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to get it up on the screen. Yeah?
Would it have had anything to do with Som Gedalia?
No.
Or was that much later?
I'm not sure what you mean, would it have had anything to do?
Well, 7 days before Yom Kippur is Som Gedalia.
Oh, I see. No. It's not connected to that necessarily. Not explicitly anyway. So let's start with the Mishnah, ladies and gentlemen. The Mishnah says as follows: Shivas Yamim Kodem Yom Kippurim. 7 days before Yom Kippur, Mafrishin Kohen Gadol Mibeso Lelishchas Parhedrin. They would separate the Kohen Gadol from his house, and they would store him. No, they would seclude him in the Lishchas Parhedrin, in the Parhedrin chamber. Okay, so he's isolating and quarantining for a week before Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur cannot happen without the Kohen Gadol. He is going to be an extraordinarily busy guy. but we have to make sure that he is tahor. We have to make sure that he is pure to be able to serve in the Beis Hamikdash on that day. And the best way of doing this was to separate him, keep him away from everybody else, keep him away from all responsibilities, so that we could guarantee that he would get to Yom Kippur in a pure state. However, that being said, what if he does become ritually impure? It's not just coming into contact with things that could make him impure. There are other ways that he could become impure as well. I have a feeling that I have momentarily frozen there. Is that accurate? Yes, I apologize. So there are, as I was trying to say, there are other ways in which a Kohen Gadol could become impure. He could become impure on his own account, right? So for that reason, the Mishnah tells us, Umaskinin lo Kohen acher tachtav, shema ye'era bo pasul. So they had to also designate a deputy Kohen Gadol who would be willing to take up the mantle should the circumstances require it. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af isha acheres maskinin lo. Not only would they have to appoint a deputy Kohen Gadol, Rabbi Yehuda says they would even need to designate a deputy wife, because Shema Tamlus Ishto, because perhaps his wife will pass away, God forbid, in the run-up to Yom Kippur. And as we will see on a number of occasions, we have this pasuk Shne'emar, the verse in Vayikra, which says V'chipeh ba'ado uva'ad beiso, that the work, the avodah of the Kohen Gadol achieves kapara, it achieves atonement for him and for his house. Well, what does it mean that he achieves atonement for his house? The Mishnah says beiso zu ishto. The word beiso implies that this is referring to his wife. So the fact that he is achieving kapara for him and his wife means that he must have a wife. So if, God forbid, something happened to his wife before Yom Kippur, they would have to have a deputy wife to be in place to provide for him. Amrulo, Chachamim, however, say back to Rabbi Yehuda, Im Kain, if that is the case, if we have to be concerned about the death of a wife as well, Ein ladavar sof. There's no end to the matter, because what if that replacement wife dies? What if the replacement of the replacement wife died? So we're taking it too many levels too far, and so the conclusion that the Chachamim make, the rabbis make, is that actually we don't require a deputy wife, but we do require a deputy Kohen Gadol, because it's far more likely or far more potential that he will become invalidated, he will become impure, and will not be able to serve in the Beis Hamikdash on that day. So that's our Mishnah. Now we'll move on to our Gemara. And we're going to be focusing on the 7 days of separation before going into Yom Kippur. Tnan Hassam, we learned in a Mishnah over there in Maseches Para, which deals with the red heifer, which deals with the Para Aduma. Now the process for the Para Aduma also required 7 days of separation, and that was specifically for the Kohen, who was going to be dealing with the burning of the Para Aduma so that they could have the ashes for use in purification processes down the line. So the Mishnah says, Shivas Yamim Kodem Sreifas HaPara, 7 days before the Kohen was due to burn the Para Aduma, Mafrishin Kohen Hasarif Es HaPara Mibeso Lelishcha She'al Pnei Habira. They would quarantine and isolate the Kohen in charge of burning the para. They would take him from his house and they would put him in a chamber that was before the bira. We're going to come to what this bira is, but they would put him in a chamber that was before the bira, Safona Mizracha, which was in the northeastern corner of the Beis Hamikdash. The Lishchas Beis Ha'even Haisan Nikres. And this Lishcha, this chamber, was known as the chamber of stone, the chamber of the house of stone. Velama nikra shema lishchas beis ha'even. And why was it called the chamber of the house of stone? Shekol ma'aseha bichlei galalim, bichlei avanim, uvichlei adama. Because the whole procedure of the Para Aduma was performed not with gold vessels, not with silver vessels, not with copper vessels. it was performed with vessels that had been made from dung, vessels that had been made from stone, and vessels that had been made from earthenware, from pottery. So these are not the usual way, or these are not the usual materials that we use from vessels, but these are all things that can't contract tumah. Gold vessels, silver vessels, these can all contract tumah, but stone, dung, and earthenware are not able to contract tumah. So these were the vessels that were being used for the procedure of the para aduma. My Tama asks the Mishnah, what is the reason that we are being so stringent for the purity of the process? Says the Gemara, Kevan de Tavul Yom Kasher Bapara. It's because a Tavul Yom is able, if they were a Kohen, to perform this service to the Para Aduma. What's a Tavul Yom? Tavul Yom is somebody who has become contaminated with ritual impurity, and all they need to do is to go to a mikveh to become pure again. But then they have a status until sunset of a Tavul Yom. They have to wait until sunset before they can resume active service. And such a person is able to perform the mitzvah of the, sorry, not until they can become active service, but until they can consume sacrificial portions. Okay, so a Tavul Yom is allowed to process the Para Aduma. Not only that, but they would actually insist that it was a Tavul Yom who would take responsibility for this process. Ditnan, metam'in hayu hakohen asarif sapara. They would purposely contaminate the kohen designated to perform this procedure. Umat bilin oso, and then they would immerse him, so he has a status of a Tavul Yom. And this was necessary. They did this lahotzi miliban shel tzedukim. They did this in order to remove any misconception from the hearts of the tzedukim, the Sadducees. Shahayu omrim b'me'orave hashemesh haisanases, because they would say that the Sadducees would say that it could only be performed by someone for whom the sun was set. So they had this whole procedure in place that since a Tavul Yom could perform the service, right? So they're being extra lenient by purposely contaminating a kohen so that he could do the service of the Para Aduma. So they had to be really strict going in the other way with the vessels that he was using. So in order to remove any chance of the Sadducees kind of getting in there and saying that the halacha goes like them, so the rabbis went completely lenient in insisting that the kohen has to have been impure and then purified and serving before sunset so that the Sadducees couldn't get a word in. But to compensate for that, Takinu Rabbanan, to compensate for that, the sages instituted Klei Galanim, Klei Avanim, and Klei Adama. They instituted that the procedure should be done with these different types of vessels: dung vessels, stone vessels, and earthenware vessels, which can't be contaminated with tumah. In order that people would not come to treat the process with contempt and think like, oh, okay, the rabbis, they clearly don't care. They just have anybody coming in and doing the work, and they don't even care what vessels they're using, etc., etc. So it was to compensate for that severe leniency of who was performing the procedure. Asks the Gemara, my shana safonim mizracha, with relevance to our Para Aduma, why are they putting this kohen in the northeastern part of the Beis Hamikdash? So the Gemara answers, Kevan Zachatasi, since the Para Aduma is a type of sin offering, so even though the actual process doesn't take place in the Beis Hamikdash, this all takes place outside of the Beis Hamikdash, but since nonetheless it is included in the list of sin offerings, v'chatas te'unat safon, and if it was being processed in the Beis Hamikdash, then it would be processed in the northern side. Uchsiv ba el nochach pnei ohel moed, and the verse which says, and you shall sprinkle the blood El Nochach Pnei Ohel Moed, the entrance to the tent of meeting, which is on the northern side. So we have two factors here. We have the north side where the sacrificial procedure would take place. We have the eastern side where the sprinkling of the blood would take place. And even though all of this is happening off-site, Takinu la Rabbanan lishcha safon mizracha ki heichi dilahave lahakira. They established that the place where this Kohen should be quarantined should be in the northeastern side in order to kind of create a heka, a recognition of where it would be taking place, were it to take place inside the Beis HaMikdash itself. Asks the Gemara, my bira, what is his name? What is this word, bira? It seems a bit unfamiliar. What are we supposed to understand from this? Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba Bar Chana said, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, Makom Haya Bahar Habayis, Ubira Shema. There was a place on the Temple Mount, and its name was Bira, and that's what we're talking about. V'reish Lakish Amar, Kol HaMikdash Kula Karui Bira. The whole temple site was called Bira. How does he know this? Because there is a verse, Shne'emar, Habira Asher Hachinosi, the Bira for which I have made provision. So a disagreement there between Rabbi Yochanan as to whether Bira is the name of a particular place on the Temple Mount, or whether the whole Beis HaMikdash was known as Bira. Now the Gemara asks, Mina Hani Mili, from where in the Torah do we derive that the concept of 7 days of separation applies to both the Yom Kippur service and also to the Para Aduma process? How do we know that these people would need to be separated for 7 days? Amar Rabbi Yumi bar Chilkiah, Amar Rabbi Mechasia bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yumi bar Chilkiah, quoting Rabbi Mechasia bar Idi, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Kra, they quote a pasuk. What is the pasuk that they quote? Ka'asher asa bayom hazeh tziva Hashem la'asos lechaper aleichem. From the avoda on Yom Kippur, brought in. No, let's try that one again. Not from the avoda brought in Yom Kippur. It's from this week's Parashas Shmini. Aaron and his sons were separated for 7 days before they started working in the Mishkan. So that concept of 7 days being designated and being separated before doing the actual work. So the verse that said Kasher Asa Bayom Hazeh, as has been done on this day, so too Hashem has commanded to make atonement for you. So what this tells us is that the concept of separation was not strictly just about Aaron and his sons in the lead up to the inauguration of the Mishkan, but it applies to other times as well. So when is it applying to? So the Gemara fleshes this out. La'asos, when the verse said la'asos, to do, elu ma'asei para. This shows that the concept of 7 days is applying to the actions involved with burning the red heifer. And lechaper, and to atone, teaches us elu ma'asei yom kippur, that this means that the 7 days is applying also to the actions performed on Yom Kippur. But now we're going to take this to course. We're going to analyze this. Bishlama, I can understand this. Kule krab para lo mitoke. I could understand if this entire verse has no relevance at all to the para aduma, lechaper kasiv, because the verse talks about kapara, talks about atonement. Upara lav bas kaparahi, and the red heifer has nothing to do with kapara. It has to do with facilitating, purifying people. So I could understand if this whole verse was really teaching us that for Yom Kippur a Kohen Gadol has to be separated, and I can understand if you then don't interpret it at all that a Kohen has to be separated for the Para Aduma. And let's say that this whole verse is just about Yom Kippur, or the implication of the verse, I should say, the future generations refers to Yom Kippur. And only the Kohen Gadol then requires a 7-day separation before performing the Yom Kippur service. Amri, we say, Yalef Tziva Tziva. We have a Gezerah Shava, which connects Tziva, the commandment of Aaron and his sons to separate before the inauguration, and we have a Tziva, which is written with relevance to the Para Aduma. Says the Gemara, Kasiv Hacha, it says over here, Kasher Tziva Hashem La'asos, like Hashem commanded to do. Uchsiv Hasam, by the Para Aduma, it's written by the Para Aduma, Zos Chukas HaTorah Asher Tziva Hashem Lemor. This is the chok, this is the statute of the Torah that Hashem has commanded, saying, Ma lahanan para, afkan para. Just like over there, it's talking about the Para Aduma, so too over here, in our verse about the inauguration, it's hinting to the Para Aduma requiring separation. Ma kan prisha, af lahanan prisha. Just like over here, with regards to the inauguration, the Kohen required separation, so too does the Kohen who is going to do the Para Aduma also requires separation. And now we turn the page to Amud Beis, to the second side. Now the Gemara is going to ask, Ve'ema tziva tzima de Yom Kippurim. But tziva is also written with regards to Yom Kippur. So maybe that's the Gezerah Shava. Maybe that's the connection that we have to use. We've got the prevalence, or the we have the usage of the word tziva both in the inauguration, but also for Yom Kippurim as well. Dichsiv, as it says, Vayas kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. As the verse says, with relevance to Yom Kippur, and he did as the Lord commanded Moses. So how are we going to get out of this one? Answers the Gemara. Danin tziva de lifnei asiya, mitziva de lifnei asiya. We are comparing two occasions on which the word tziva was used before an action, before a performance was used. And that only applies to the Para Aduma. Ve'ein danin tzivan de la'achar asiya, mitziva de lifnei asiya. And we're not then comparing two usages of the word tziva when one was coming before the verb of asiya, of action, and one which comes after the verb for action, which is why then it's preferable, according to the Gemara, to make our connection between the Para Aduma and not with the service on Yom Kippur. Asks the Gemara though, Ve'ema tziva de korbanos. Maybe every korban should have a separation of 7 days, right? Because tziva is used over there as well. Says the pasuk, Dichsiv, Bayom Savoso es b'nei Yisrael, on the day that he commanded the children of Israel. So the Gemara answers to this, Danin tziva mitziva, ve'ein danin tzivasa mitziva. The Gezerah Shava is made between two identical words, tziva in the instance of the inauguration and tziva with regards to the Para Aduma. But the word used for the sacrifices is tzavoto. So if we have the choice between making a Gezerah Shava between two identical words and two dissimilar words, we're going to choose the identical words instead. Umay nafkamina. Why? What's the practical difference? What's the implication between these two terms? Vahatana devei Rabbi Yishmael. But we have a famous teaching of Rabbi Yishmael, V'shav hakohen uba hakohen, with relevance to the Metzora process. If you were trying to determine whether a house had been afflicted with soras, so the priest would have to return and come. There was a process involved where the Kohen who is visiting this house would have to come and check it out. He would go away and he would come back at 7 days later to see what the status of that house was. In one instance, the verse says V'shav hakohen, that he should return, and in another instance it says Uba hakohen, and he should come. But we have a famous teaching from Rabbi Yishmael who says Zuhi Shiva, Zuhi Bia. Even though these are two dissimilar words, they are talking about the same thing, and the halacha is trying to convey the same thing. So we see an example where two dissimilar words are used, and yet we are able to do a gezerah shava and learn a practical halacha between these two instances. So the Gemara answers, Hani mili heicha deleka dedamile. Rabbi Shmuel's lesson applies because there's no other opportunity, there's no other possibility for a word in the Torah to be utilized to make the comparison. But where in this instance, for example, you do have the opportunity to use identical words, the rabbis are going to choose to utilize an identical word to learn the halacha rather than to use dissimilar words, which means that we still have our verse about the inauguration, which is applying to the Yom Kippur service, and it's applying to the Para Aduma. Says the Gemara, lechaper. Now having a look at this word, lechaper, to achieve atonement, to make atonement, elu maaseh Yom Kippurim. This is referring to the actions of Yom Kippur. That's how we've learned our verse, but we're going to challenge this. Ve'ema kapara to korbanos. Maybe we should say that this kapara is referring to korbanos, in which case for all sacrifices, or for all sacrifices involved with atonement, you have to separate for 7 days before you go and perform it. Why can't we say that? The Gemara asks, as a challenge to this, Mi adinan hey kohen misrame debai le parisha. Do we know in advance which kohen is going to be allocated to processing that sacrifice for us to then be able to separate him and to keep him quarantined? The kohanim who would come in family shifts would only find out by way of a lottery system, by way of a raffle system, as to who was going to be in charge of any given sacrifice. So how are we going to know which kohen needs to be separated? So the Gemara says back to this, Amri alamala, why shouldn't we know? We know which kohen family is going to come to the Beis HaMikdash for a week as a shift to work in the Beis HaMikdash. So let's separate the whole family, the whole shift, for a week beforehand. And that way we know that whichever kohen is going to be given the responsibility of processing that korban, he will have separated. Answers the Gemara, Danin davar shekavu alozman, midavar shekavu alozman. We are going to learn from something which has a fixed time during the year, like Yom Kippur, from something which had a fixed time as well, the inauguration of the Beis HaMikdash. And we're not going to learn haphazardly for a shift that's arriving in the Beis HaMikdash, and we don't know which day he's going to get the korban, and we don't know who's it going to be. There are too many uncertain factors here. So it makes more sense to learn from two things which have a fixed time allocation. La'afuke korbanos dekol yoma isnahu. And that excludes then the sacrifices which come every single day. So the Gemara says, Ve'ema regalim. All right, well, maybe the regalim, these are fixed things in time. Maybe when Kohanim are coming to serve in the Beis HaMikdash over Yom Tovim, maybe they have to separate for a week beforehand. Answers the Gemara, Danin davar shenoheg pam achas b'shana, midavar hanoheg pam achas b'shana. No, because the unique thing about Yom Kippur is it only happens once in the year. Regalim happen 3 times in the year. So it makes more sense for us to compare the inauguration, which happened once in the year, along with Yom Kippur, which happens once in the year, and not lafuke regalim delav pam achas b'shana ninu. And that would exclude then the Yom Tovim, which is not performed just once in a year, but is performed 3 times in the year. Well, I know what you're going to ask. Ve'ema regal echad. So then let's say it applies to one of the regalim. For one of the regalim, the kohanim have to separate. And if you're going to turn around and say to me, well, I don't know which one. Is it Pesach? Is it Shavuos? Is it Sukkot? So Ichag HaMitzvahs, if you want to tell me, it could be Pesach. Because that's the festival that gets mentioned first. So that's the one that should have the separation. Ichag Sukkos, or you could tell me that it's Sukkos, because there are so many commandments associated with Sukkot. There's so many different korbanot, and there's all of the different mitzvahs that had to be done on Sukkot. So maybe that could be the festival that you go with. I don't care which one you go with. Go with Pesach, go with Sukkot. Doesn't bother me, but go with one of them. Answers the Gemara. I just lost my place. Ela danin parisha shiva. Sorry. Ela danin parisha shiva leyom echad. Rather, we are going to compare the requirement of separating for 7 days because you need to be ready for 1 day. Meprishas shiva liyom echad. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So we're going to compare 2 occasions where you're separating for 7 days in order to be ready for 1 day. Ve'ein done in prishas shiva l'shiva, meprishas shiva liyom echad. Rather than learn a halacha that applies for a 7-day period, right? In which case we'll be separating 7 days for a 7-day period, and we're learning that from a 7-day separation for 1 day, which was the inauguration. So it makes more sense to separate for Yom Kippur, which is 1 day of the year, rather than to separate for something that lasts 7 days, because that's already too dissimilar from the case in the inauguration. Now the question I had on this is, well, why not Shavuos then? Shavuos lasts 1 day. So you could have said, well, that's one of the regalim, and it's 1 day. So maybe that is where we're going next. I don't know why the Gemara doesn't go there. I suspect it's because you do actually have a week of Shavuos to be able to bring your korbanot, even though the Yom Tov lasts only 1 day. For whatever reason, the next question of the Gemara is Ve'ema Shmini Deprishas Shiva Liyom Echad. Well, maybe then Shmini Atzeres should be the day that they are separating for, and that would be Deprishas Shiva Liyom Echad. And then you would find that you're separating for 7 days in preparation for 1 day. So the Gemara answers for this: Danin da'avar she'ein kedusha lefanav midavar she'ein kedusha lefanav ve'ein danin davar sheyesh kedusha lefanav midavar she'ein kedusha lefanav. The difference between Yom Kippur and Shmini Atzeres is that Shmini Atzeres has 7 holy days in the run-up to that day occurring, whereas Yom Kippur doesn't have 7 days of sanctity before you get to Yom Kippur. So we're going to prefer to choose a day on which there is no Kedusha happening before it, rather than Shmini Atzeres, which does have days of Kedusha in the run-up to it. But now the Gemara is going to ask, V'lav kal v'chomer, shouldn't it make more sense from the standpoint of a kal v'chomer that Shmini Atzeres should be the day that we are choosing? Hashtag davar she'ein kedusha lefanav boi prisha, right? A day which does not have any kedusha leading up to it, like the inauguration or like Yom Kippur, and we're saying that it requires separation. Davar sheyesh kedusha lefanav lo kol shekain. Shouldn't a day where there is separation where there is kedusha happening before it, all the more so, you should require 7 days of separation before it? So Amar Rav Misharshia says in response to this, Lo, that is not the case. Why? Because our verse said, with regards to the inauguration, Hazeh, that it has to be like this day. Kasiv Kazeh. So the verse says Hazeh, and from this we learn Kazeh, that it has to be like this day. This day, the inauguration, there was no Kedusha before it, and so too we are looking for a day which is Kazeh, which is like this one, which also doesn't have Kedusha before it, and that would apply to Yom Kippur, that wouldn't apply to Shmini Atzeres. Ravashi says, Mi ika midi de ika rega lo boi parisha, tafel diidei boi parisha. Would it make sense to have a primary festival like Sukkot, which doesn't require the Kohanim to separate for 7 days beforehand, and now the Tafel, the lesser secondary day of Shmini Atzeres, you're saying all of a sudden that would require separation? That doesn't seem to make sense. And even according to the opinion who says that Shmini Atzeres is considered a regel on its own individual merit, on its own account, Hanimini le'inyan pazar kashav. That would only apply to 6 mitzvahs, which we see at the top of the next page. 6 mitzvahs is Shmini Atzeres considered its own chag, but with regards to anything else, it is considered as a secondary part of the Sukkot festival. And so for that reason, the conclusion that we reach as far as today's Gemara goes is that you require 7 days of separation for Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur, and you require 7 days of separation for a Kohen who is going to perform the procedure of the Para Aduma. Just to clarify what these 6 mitzvahs are, this is an acronym, Pazar Kashav. They refer to the following things. The pay refers to Pais, the lottery system that was in place. So for Sukkot, you didn't have a lottery system of allocating responsibility to the Kohanim. But on Shmini Atzeres, because there was only one par, as opposed to Sukkot, where there were several animals that required sacrificing, Shmini Atzeres only had one par, and so that was allocated to Kohanim by way of lottery. So that makes it distinct from the rest of Sukkot. Zman, there was a, you would still say Shehechianu v'Shmini Atzeres, which makes it separate from Sukkot. Regel, we call it a completely different name in our Shmona Esrei. Yeah, for the whole of Sukkot we say B'yom Chag Sukkos Hazeh, but for Shmini Atzeres we say Shmini Chag Hatzeres. So it has its own name, so that makes it distinguishable from Sukkot. For Korban, the Kuf, the sacrifices are different, so it makes it distinguished from the rest of Sukkot. Shir, it would have its own song that would be sung, unique for that day, as opposed to the rest of Sukkot. And bracha, they would make a special bracha for the life of the king, so that again distinguishes it from Sukkot. So even according to the opinion that says, look, we've got 6 instances where Shmini Atzeres is considered a completely separate Yom Tov, nonetheless we conclude that it was only with regards to those 6 things, and actually for everything else, Shmini Atzeres is just a part of the entity that is Sukkot. Now, there was a question asked in the chat. There were also 3 days of preparation before the first Shavuot. That is true, but that doesn't apply to the rest of Shavuot for the rest of the Shavuots in history. That was 3 days that the Bnei Yisrael had to separate before being able to receive the Torah, and that's not with regards to the separation that we're talking about here, which is for Kohanim to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. So my question still stands. I don't know if I'm going to find an answer on this cycle of Daf Yomi as to why we jumped straight to Shmini Atzeres. I don't know if we will ask the question about Shavuos in tomorrow's Daf. We'll have to wait and see. But for now, that's all for today. So I wish everybody a most wonderful and meaningful day. We will continue next Sunday with the regular Daf for that day. So we're not going to be doing page 9 next week. I think we will be doing page 7 next week. So Mazel Tov for all those finishing Maseches Shekalim, and we'll see you again for Daf Zayin next Sunday of Maseches Yomi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Massive pleasure to you all.